Hello, and welcome to episode 20 of That 60s Recording Podcast. Conversations inspired by the golden era of recording. So here we are, 2021. The last episode that you listened to with Malcolm Toft was a pre-recorded intro. So this is the first time that I am speaking to you in the what I hope is a slightly better year of 2021. So we are in the midst of another lockdown in the UK, which is absolutely brilliant. And I know that that was sarcastic, by the way. I know that a lot of the listeners, in fact, the majority of listeners are over in the US. So yeah, you may not know that that's what's happening here, but yeah, we're in another lockdown, which is great. So spending all day, every day with my wife and kids, which is really nice. But it means that progress on sort of work and studio things is a lot slower than it used to be. It's sort of, obviously it's exactly the same as March. But here's hoping that we all get vaccinated in a double quick time and we can all get back to doing things again. I'm quite excited about this year for the podcast. I've learnt a lot over throughout 2020 about making podcasts and hosting podcasts. And I've got a lot of ideas for guests that I want to feature on the podcast, and some ideas of subjects. So rather than having a guest specifically who I speak to about the guest, like subject matters, like I did with Ed Alesko when we did the guitar rundown, I think more episodes like that would be quite nice, where we focus in on a particular feature. As always, I'm really open to feedback from you guys, and you know, this is I want it to be a dialogue, and I'm hoping to still strike that balance between having people who were involved directly in 60s recording and then having modern era producers who obviously not always are recording completely analog. Obviously everybody has to get it into the computer at some point, but they, as you've kind of discovered if you're a regular listener to this podcast, is that the 60s recording is an ethos as much as anything else. And it seems to be that everybody who interests me that I'd like to speak to is a big 60s music fan, obviously namely the Beatles, and records in a way that is sympathetic to the way that they did it in the 60s. Even if they're not particularly aware of it, it's definitely just an attitude that people have towards recording. So I think it's particularly interesting to talk with modern producers and engineers as well as guys who were directly there. And again, I would welcome suggestions, comments, subjects, whatever, anything you want to get in touch about. I will be gratefully received. So anyway, along those lines, the guest I have today is Shel Talmy, who is a producer, so not an engineer or anything like that, just a straight up producer from the US who worked over there for a bit and then made his way to the UK, which we'll talk more a bit about in the interview, and ended up through a little bit of a sleight of hand, if you like, getting a job at Decca Records and then becoming a really renowned producer working with the Kinks, the Who, and a whole host of other people, which you'll hear about throughout the podcast. So it's a slightly shorter interview, but it was slightly too long just to leave in one bulk. It's January, we're all tired, so I've left it as two slightly shorter episodes, so it's not so much for you to wade through. Okay, so here we go. Shel Talmy. So I'm really, really pleased to be joined by Shel Talmy. Actually joined for the second time because you guys won't know, but I made a huge clanger last week and completely messed my timings up. So I very much appreciate you giving me your time again for the second time.
Well, stuff happens.
Yeah, it seems to happen to me quite a lot, which I probably shouldn't say, but it does. It does. I think I'll blame having two children and a busy life. But there we go. So I'd like to start off because you're known, you're sort of famous for being a producer of music, and I just wondered if you could describe in your words what a producer in the 1960s role was within the recording process.
Well, the producer's role, it depends on who you're talking to. I am in the category of what those of us do as a hands-on producer. I'm really there from the beginning to the end. I don't check in once a week for a half hour. I start out with finding a talent or an artist or a group or whatever, and if I'm going to be producing them, either for starting out with singles or LPs, I will work with them on choosing material. I do the arrangements. I hire additional musicians if necessary. Obviously, book the studio. I'm there for the entire recording sessions. So therefore, it's not just the initial recording, but it's overdubs and all that entails, and backing vocals, and then finally the mixes, and eventually the mastering. So I'm really there from beginning to end.
Wow, you very, very much are hands-on in that respect. I've read in previous interviews that you've given, and I'm supposing for that reason that you tend to only work with artists that you must feel a really affiliation for the music for.
Yeah, well, if you mean would I want to record somebody who can sing, you're quite correct. Yes, I know.
I guess you've got to really like the music.
There's a whole bunch of artists these days who I would hope thank their whatever gods they worship every night for Melodyne. There's people who are rather singers, and there's a whole bunch of them, as I'm sure you're aware, that sing off key, and with Melodyne, you know, nobody would know, but I know. And the fact that they have attained as much notoriety as they have is kind of insulting to the people who really can sing.
Yeah, it certainly is frustrating. I mean, I know plenty of, as we all do, plenty of singers who are fantastic, who don't have the career that they deserve. But I guess in the sense that you must, every artist that you work with, you must really invest in and be really passionate about that music. Otherwise, you wouldn't be able to, I suppose mentally, you wouldn't be able to give the amount you do in the process.
No, well, no, that's true. If I don't like the artist or the group, and I don't like the material, I won't do it. There's no point in it. I mean, I'm there to make the best kind of music I can with the best kind of artists I can find. If those things don't exist, there's no point in hiring me to try and do it.
Absolutely. And so let's go back to the beginning and hopefully put a bit of that in context. So I read that the high school that you went to was they must have had something in the water, because Phil Spector went there, Michael Jackson went there, you went there, and a whole host of people.
It's interesting. There's two high schools here in LA that are known for specific things. I went to one called Fairfax, which is mainly musical. Hollywood High was mainly actors and actresses, and okay, Beverly Hills High also has a lot of actors and actresses in it. But Fairfax was particularly known for the musical people. You know, had Lieber and Stoller. We had Herbie Alpert. We had all kinds of people, you know, coming out of Fairfax.
I see. So, did you go there specifically to study music, or did you just happen to be?
No. It was my neighborhood high school.
Oh wow. Okay. So, did you have any idea at that point that music was something you'd go on to pursue?
It was always in the back of my mind. I originally was going to. I thought I was going to be a film director and doing that kind of stuff, and for various reasons that didn't happen. So music was always my number two or equal number one, if you like. and that's what the way it worked out. That's how I wound up with music.
Okay. And then how? So you ended up with a job at Conway Studios.
Correct.
Then what came between high school and getting that job? How did that come about?
Oh, I went to college, and I took a what I thought was a totally unrelated course, which is psychology, and which I found out did help me a great deal with a couple of three bands in particular, and uh, and frankly, I got bored. I mean, I don't know if you know many people in psychology or psychiatrists or shrinks, if you like. Uh, when I first started the first class, I discovered out of the class of about, I think there was maybe 25 or 30 of us, that one other girl and I were the only two sane people in the place. You all the others were there to solve their own problems. uh, so anyway, that's one of the reasons why I never took it up.
Okay, and that led to, and then how did you sort of go between that to getting the job at Conway? Did you
Okay,
approach
well,
them?
I actually worked for ABC Television first,
Oh, okay.
and also one of the local channels here. And I started I was a page, I did cue cards, I started doing floor managing, and I then discovered, which was probably good that early on, that I was not really extremely good with corporate politics. And it was smothering. And so I got out of there. And in LA at the time was a place called Martoni's, which was an Italian restaurant, but was kind of the music biz hangout. and that's where I met Phil Yend, who owned Conway, and we became good friends. And I said, I'm looking around to do something. He said, why don't you come and become a recording engineer, and I'll teach you all. I said, okay, sounds good. So that's how I wound up there.
Wow, that's. I just love the little sort of serendipitous events that happen that lead
No,
people to places.
I think one's life is wound up with serendipity, don't you think? I mean, if
Absolutely.
it wasn't for various things that happen, I'm not sure anybody would actually wind up doing what they do.
Yeah, I think you're absolutely spot on. I mean, the psychiatry that you're talking about. I mean, there's a huge amount of sort of work. Well, you're working with people as a producer, aren't you? And coaching an artist in a sense, and that's
Right.
seems very well placed to set you up to do that.
Yeah, oh, yeah, sure, but I never approached working with an artist like I was a shrink or anything like that, except for one band. I did Manfred Mann was the band where I always consider myself the resident shrink as opposed to the producer. I mean, these guys would argue about anything in the middle of a take, and they were all university guys, and they all believed they were super smart, and that they would argue about anything and everything, and I had to say, "Hey guys, time, let's continue on with the session." And so, yeah, that was amusing, but not permanently.
Yeah, I can imagine. So, what was recording or working at Conway like? Did you have much free reign, or were you able to?
Oh,
Or was
no, I'll tell you how much free reign I had. That I was there for 3 days, and Phil said, "Well, you're doing a session on your own from now on." So
Wow.
that's being a band. That first session that I did, which is very memorable, I will never forget it, was actually they were a jazz septet. And I had no problem. I learned the board. We're talking about pretty simple boards now, with rotary pots and all that kind of thing. And it was only 3-track we had as the amount of multi-tracks, and obviously, just mono, single track machines as well.
Mm-hmm.
And so that was easy to learn, and I learned. And the microphones were simple, I found, and I was able to learn what they did and how to mic them and all. So all that part was fine. What then really threw me is that I record the band, and it was coming out great. They then wanted an edit, and I had never done an edit, and that's at that point in time with tape, there wasn't even any edit blocks. Phil would do freehand edits with a pair of scissors, and I had never even tried it before, so I did. I think I lost about 10 pounds while I was doing all this. And I finally, somehow or another, I know I got it together and it worked. And what I also remember is that I didn't charge him for an hour of time because it took me so long to do this. It should have taken me 4 minutes, 3 minutes, maybe.
Wow. I mean, I can only imagine. It's your first session, and the pressure you must have felt would have been immense. I mean, how old were you at that point?
21 or 2, I think.
Wow. And in charge of a session with 7 musicians, it's madness. You must have felt a lot of pressure.
No, that didn't bother me. I mean, doing the rest of that was fine. I was fairly confident that I could get it done. Mm-hmm. But when I was thrown that kind of a curve, which was unexpected, that really did get to me. And Conway, but you're probably going to ask more about it, but if you're not, I'll tell you about it. Conway was the studio for the Wrecking Crew. You know what the Wrecking Crew is, yes?
Absolutely, yeah. You took the next question out of my mouth.
Okay, well, they loved that studio. It was a great studio. And so I got a chance to record all of those guys on several things, which was really a pleasure because I was working with the best musicians in LA at the time. It was great.
They are. I mean, the sort of creme de la creme. We've had David Hood, the bass player, on. I've spoken to him for this podcast, and he was such a lovely guy. And I can only imagine what life must have been like then.
Oh yeah, they were all terrific. And then again, I've always gotten along with musicians. I just, before you even asked the question, I have unfortunately not gotten along with managers very often because I find that most of them, about the only talent they have is a gift of gab of inducing naive artists to be managed by them. And most of them have absolutely no talent and shouldn't even be allowed to exist, but there you go. Anyways, musicians are great. I have a great respect for musicians because I play guitar, but I'm a good enough producer not to ever want to record myself on guitar. So I respect really good musicians, and I had the opportunity to work with the best of them.
Did you have a particular sort of session setup at Conway that you used? So are you using the same mic techniques for each session?
Well, since you apparently have done your homework, you know that I and Phil experimented a lot on how to mic everything better. And, one of the things that I eventually did was everybody at that point was using 3 mics or 4 mics maximum on drums. And I wound up using a dozen. Wow. And some I brought with me here in LA. And then when I went to England, everybody was doing that. And they said, you can't do that because it'll phase or whatever. And I said, well, I guess, wait and see. And, 2 or 3 months later, everybody was trying to use 12 mics. So, yes, I spent a lot of time doing that. So that was a lot of my off time and Phil and I would do isolation and how to record various instruments and all that kind of stuff. It really was well worthwhile doing all that stuff.
It's another one of those interesting things where at that point in your career, given the space to experiment and I'm assuming learn from mistakes and all that kind of stuff, would set you in good stead for what was coming up later.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. No, I had a chance to make mistakes, because it was fairly, I mean, by today's standard, it was totally primitive. So, everybody was making mistakes, and there's a lot of very bad recording going on. And there was some very good recording going on by people who had invested time like I had. So, I preferred being at that end of the scale. And Phil was the same way. Phil was a brilliant engineer. And yeah, we had a good time.
So then you took a holiday to the UK for, was it 3 months that you were
Well,
just
no,
going?
I planned on going for 5 or 6 weeks. Phil was English and kept telling me how wonderful London was, and I thought, shit, I'm early 20s, before life passes me by. I really should go see some of the rest of the world. So I said, okay, I'm going for 5 or 6 weeks. I want to do London. I want to go to Paris, and like that. And how it came about that I stayed was I thought, okay, I'm going to be gone that amount of time. If I could work for a couple of weeks, so I didn't have a whole lot of bread, I would do that. And I took the precaution of asking around and about people rather, I'm talking about people that I knew in LA at labels, who I could speak to. And one in particular, my friend Nick Benet, who was at that point, when he was like the A&R guy over at Capitol Records, and he said, I just finished some acetates of stuff I've been doing. Take them with you. And so you did them, because I hadn't really ever produced anything. So yeah, pretty much. I've done a lot of engineering, but not really production. I've done like one or two things. And I said, okay, great. And when I got there, I went to one of the people I was recommended to go to, who made an appointment for me to go see Dick Rowe at Decca. And I walked in, and I thought, okay, I'm not going to be here very long. I will assume a role. I will be as expected, a loud, opinionated American. And so I said, well, here I am, and arguably, I may be the best producer you've met since sliced bread was invented. And I said, I brought these. This is what I just done. And I presented Nick's acetates, which were Lou Rawls and the Beach Boys. And so,
wow.
So he played them both. He said, "You start today." So, and by the time everybody found out it was total crap, I had already had a big hit. And I thought, okay, I might as well stay on for a while. And I went up staying 17 years.
Wow, that's such a fantastic story. What confidence it must have taken to step in and do that. I love it.
Well, I had nothing to lose. I didn't have anything. I knew I was going back. In fact, I had a singles deal with a very good label here in LA, that they offered me right before. I said, I'm on this trip. I'll be back. I'd be delighted to do it. So I was apparently going to be a producer regardless. And arriving in London, doing what I did, my only reason for doing any of it was to see if I could make some money for a couple of weeks' work. And so basically, I really didn't care what I said. I mean, I thought, I can be brash as hell, and I wasn't impolite, but I was brash, and like that. So that's the way it worked out.
And am I right in thinking you lived on King's Road when you were in London?
I lived all over that area. I certainly lived right off the King's Road, not on it. And I also lived in South Kensington, and I also eventually lived in Belgravia and Knightsbridge. But I did start out around King's Road, yes.
Could you, I mean, for anybody who's slightly younger and doesn't know doesn't know Kings Road, it's the street that's sort of infamous with that stereotypical '60s culture. What was it like in
Oh, it was
when you were there?
fantastic. It was a situation that was a happening about to happen. And as I got there, I mean, there was probably, I'm going to guess there were 300 to 400 people that pretty much knew each other, not personally by sight anyhow. And when there was a party, all four of us used to descend on the party. And Kings Road at that time was made up of pretty much every kind of artistic type that you want to know about. Photographers, actors, actresses, music, film, whatever. I mean, anything to do with some sort of artistic endeavor could be found there, and then the whole damn thing just exploded. I'm not sure what happened, but all of a sudden, all of us found things to do and started making names for ourselves.
Wow. I mean, was it? I'm going off a tangent for me here, but was it a sort of a cheaper place to live? Because that tends to be the way that artists live or inhabit a sort of a cheaper area, and then that's when it becomes more expensive.
I think what your listeners and everybody else has to realize that in the early 1960s, everything was cheaper, especially London, which was still getting over the war, and the difference being, for your English listeners, to get into a black taxi at that point in time cost a whole threepence as the initial amount of money you'd have to pay to get across London for probably about 3 or 4 shillings.
Wow. I mean, I wouldn't even dare go near a taxi now. You go down the street, it costs you 20 quid.
Exactly. Yeah. So that's everything was cheaper, and yes, so consequently we were able to afford it, and fortunately, I found a job immediately. Not that I was being paid a fortune, but by those standards, I mean, by today's standards, I probably was.
What did you think of the English music scene compared to what you'd seen in LA?
Oh, it was way more polite, is the word I think I used, and a lot of English used to use that word also. When I got there's sort of guys and girls I met who knew the American music scene, and they said, by comparison, ours is just too polite, and which it was. And then it eventually erupted also.
So you were, I mean, you've said in numerous interviews that I've read that you sort of, I mean, I'm paraphrasing, but kind of set about to make your records more aggressive. Seems a really heavy word, but that's kind of the nature of, say, you really got me, or what you did with the Who. They are aggressive sounding to an extent.
Well, I absolutely liked doing that kind of music. The other thing that I also taught myself or learned how to do when I was in LA at the studio was to make records louder than anybody else. So I brought that with me also. And consequently, my records absolutely stood. Yeah, you really got me as far as I'm concerned. It was so much fun to do because it was aggressive, and also wound up having one of the more iconic openings of all time. So, it worked out great, and as did, of course, all the Who stuff, which they were even heavier duty than the Kinks were.
Absolutely. Can I mean, I'm sure some of the while we're just mentioning "You Really Got Me," there's I'm sure some of my listeners will be aware of the rumor of Jimmy Page playing the solo during that song. I wonder if you could just.
I knew you were going to bring that up. This will be, I'm guessing, about the 6,455th time I've answered this question. Jimmy Page did not play the solo on "You Really Got Me." He was there as a rhythm guitarist, period, end of statement.
Fantastic. I'll move on. I just wanted to get that in there in case anybody messaged me and said you didn't address that.
Okay.
What was he like to work with and Bobby Graham on drums? It's
Oh no, Bobby was one of my favorite people. He was a really good guy, excellent drummer, the best session drummer at that point in time. And Jimmy Page was excellent. I always got along with Jimmy. I was somebody mentioned that they heard this kid who was really good, and I sought him out and got him, and he was better than good. So I started using him pretty much exclusively. And the same thing was when I found Nicky Hopkins. I used him exclusively and turned him on to, but he eventually wound up using Nicky Hopkins. So as I said earlier, I love and have great respect for really excellent musicians. So all those three guys certainly fit into that.
How did it work in terms of session musicians like those guys and the bands that they're playing instruments on the records for? It's a bit of it feels in the modern day now, it feels a bit of a strange thing to happen. How did it feel then?
Well, why would it feel like a strange thing to happen now?
Well, I mean, I suppose if a band like the Kinks came along and a lot of the musicians got replaced on the record by session guys, or it just feels like
okay. Well, all right. Well, for openness, let's see if I can address this because it's a fairly large question. I'll try to be as succinct as possible. Many bands, both England and America, did not play on their own records initially because they weren't good enough and session musicians were employed, most of which you probably don't even know about, but it happened more times than you would think of. I tried to use musicians, if at all possible, from the band, and if they weren't up to what I thought they should be, I hired somebody else. And I'm trying to think if I ever used. Yeah, I did have a couple of bands, so I used totally session musicians, but not many. Well, okay, let's talk about the Kinks. They did at that point in time. They did not have a drummer, which is why I hired Bobby Graham. Mick Avery was not available at that time, or wasn't hired at that time. I don't know which. Anyway, that's how I got Bobby Graham. Secondly, I used Jimmy Page on guitar as a rhythm guitarist because Ray basically did not want to play rhythm guitar and sing at the same time. He wanted to concentrate on singing. So that's how that wound up. And for the album for the Kinks, I added John Lord on organ because he was brilliant and I needed one. And I had Perry Ford playing piano, which he did on You Really Got, because nobody was playing keyboards in the band. And I thought it needed it. So that's how all that worked out. It's not something like I thought or that I hate what you guys sound like. I'm going to hire you.
But it was, I mean, it sounds like it was a generally accepted thing from the band's point of view that may or may not happen. And, did they just accept that?
No, it was. I mean, nobody was, as far as, well, I mean, I never lied about it. I just said, if you guys are up to it, that's cool. We'll go with it. And most of the bands that I wound up recording were totally up to it. There's very few times that I ever, in fact, I said I think I did one band that replaced everybody because the band was awful. And it never happened, by the way. I mean, whatever I recorded, I don't even remember what we're talking about at this point. But it didn't happen. But I always try to use the guys who were part of the band. It seemed like the right thing to do.
Yeah, but ultimately you're trying to make the best record possible, I suppose. So whatever gets the best results.
That's what I was after, to make the record I was doing as good as possible.
Yeah. So there we go. Part 1 of the interview with Shel Talmy. I hope you enjoyed that. I I got some interesting feedback from my dad, who is an avid listener. Hi, Dad. I know you're listening to this. About the musical intros and outros, and he said, "I think it sounds like I've started listening to a different podcast, or some music had just appeared from nowhere." So I'm working on the fades and making the fades slightly longer and talking over the music so as not to confuse my dad. I should also mention that I have a mammoth list of. Those of you who listen regularly again will know that I do these isolated drums where I send out re-recordings that I've played and made of Ringo's drum parts, sort of note for note, really particular, and I try and get the sounds really right, and I send them out on a mailing list, which you can find at allyouneedisdrums.com, and I'm working my way through currently a list of the most requested songs I've had. It's about 25 songs, so that will do me half the year. Just sort of notating them down, and the ones that are coming out the day that you're listening to this, potentially, which will be the 19th of January, is We Can Work It Out, and I've just started transcribing the medley from Abbey Road. So that will feature at some stage. It certainly won't be next week. I don't know how long it's going to take me to transcribe it, but that's what I'm working on. So just wanted to tell you that if you're new to the podcast and you haven't checked that out already. Okay, so next episode in a fortnight's time will be the second part of the short and sweet conversation with Shel Talmy. And it just leaves me to say, if you'd like to get in contact with me, you can do that by my email address, which is joe@allyouneedisdrums.com, or you can go to allyouneedisdrums.com to get in touch through my website, or I'm on Instagram at allyouneedisdrums. Which seems to be where a lot of people contact me. I've had a lot of messages through there and some suggestions, which has been really useful, and I'm working on those as we speak. As usual, I'd like to say a big thank you to my good friend Joe Kane for the intro and outro music he so amazingly made for me, and to my good friend David Henshaw, who supplies the artwork for the podcast that I put out every fortnight, which you'll be able to see the artwork on Instagram, but he made the logo for the podcast too. So thank you very much to both of you guys. Okay, so there we go. Have a absolutely fantastic fortnight, and I will see you in a couple of weeks, or hear you in a couple of weeks. Okay, goodbye.